My name is Ivy Jonas. I'm 40 years old, and I have ruined every relationship I've ever had. Not because I cheated. Not because I stopped loving people, but because the moment someone gets too close to me, something inside my chest begins to rot.
I stopped sleeping properly. I analyzed every silence, every delayed text, every shift in tone. If a man says he needs space, I hear abandonment. If he says he loves me, I hear manipulation. If he gets angry, even once, my entire body prepares for war. And the worst part is that I know exactly where it comes from. My mother. People always say children learn love from their parents. Well, I learned fear, I learned instability. I learned that love is temporary and dangerous and humiliating. I learned that men leave and women break, and nobody ever protects the child standing in the corner listening to everything. My mother's name was Ivy Jonas, and she never stayed alone for more than 2 weeks in her entire life. When I was growing up, our apartment changed constantly, but the men changed even faster. Some were charming, some were loud, some drank. Some disappeared overnight. Some screamed at her until 2 in the morning while I hid under blankets pretending not to hear. And through all of it, my mother kept chasing relationships like they were oxygen. I don't think she ever understood what it did to me, or maybe she did. Maybe she just didn't care enough to stop. The first memory I have of my mother crying over a man, I was 6 years old. We lived in a tiny apartment above a laundromat in Baltimore. I remember the smell of detergent permanently soaked into the walls. I remember cockroaches near the kitchen sink. I remember cartoons playing quietly while my mother sat on the floor in the hallway wearing one of her old satin robes. She was crying so hard she could barely breathe. A man named Curtis had left her. I didn't know who Curtis was exactly because men came and went so often back then. But I knew he mattered because she hadn't brushed her hair in 3 days. I walked over and touched her arm. "Mom?" She looked at me with swollen eyes. "What?" "I'm hungry." And I swear to God, I still remember the look she gave me, like I was interrupting her suffering. Like my existence was inconvenient. "There's cereal in the kitchen, Ivy." That was it. No hug, no apology, no "I'm sorry mommy's upset." Just cereal. I poured stale cereal into a plastic bowl and sat alone watching television while my mother cried over a man who probably forgot her name within a month. That became my childhood. Men arriving, men leaving. Mother collapsing. Me surviving quietly nearby. By the time I was 9, I could recognize relationship patterns better than adults. I knew when a man was temporary. The temporary ones moved fast. Too affectionate, too loud. They brought gifts early. They called my mother baby constantly. Those relationships exploded quickly. The dangerous ones were calmer. Those were the men who stayed long enough to become part of the furniture, part of the atmosphere, part of my nervous system. Like Leonard. Leonard moved in when I was 11. He worked construction and smelled like cigarettes and wet concrete. At first, he was kind to me. He bought me strawberry milkshakes and once helped me with a school science project. For a while, I thought maybe this one would be different. Then the arguments started. At first, they waited until I went to bed. Then they stopped caring. I used to sit at the top of the hallway stairs listening to plates slam downstairs while my mother screamed things like, "You think you can control me?" And Leonard yelling back, "You flirt with every man that looks at you." Then doors slamming. Glass breaking. Silence. The silence was always the worst part. Because silence meant damage assessment. Who was crying? Who got hit? Who was leaving? One night, around midnight, I walked into the kitchen because I heard my mother sobbing. She was sitting on the floor holding ice against her cheek. I froze. There was purple swelling near her eye. I didn't know what to say. I was 11. 11-year-olds shouldn't know what domestic violence looks like, but I did. Mom. She looked up at me. And instead of comforting me, instead of protecting me from the terror of seeing her like that, she said something I never forgot. This is what happens when you love somebody too much. I carried those words for decades. This is what happens when you love somebody too much. Not, this is wrong. Not, you deserve better. Not, no man should hurt you. No, she taught me that suffering was the price of intimacy, that pain was normal, that chaos meant passion. And God help me, part of me believed it for years. Leonard stayed another 8 months. The police came twice during that time. The second time, I remember standing outside barefoot in pajamas while neighbors watched from windows. One officer asked me quietly if I felt safe at home. I looked at my mother standing nearby, mascara running down her face, glaring at me with panic, and I lied. Yes, because protecting her had already become my job. That's what happens to children like me. We stop being children. We become emotional janitors, cleaning up everybody else's mess. By 13, I had anxiety so severe I chewed the skin off my fingers until they bled. Teachers thought I was shy. I wasn't shy. I was exhausted. Every day, I came home wondering what version of my mother I would find. Heartbroken, in love, drunk, crying, furious, obsessed, empty. There was never stability, never peace. Sometimes she ignored me for days because she was consumed by relationship drama. Other times she clung to me emotionally like I was her therapist. I remember one night she sat on my bed talking for nearly 3 hours about a man named Victor who cheated on her. I was 14. And my mother was crying to me about sex and betrayal and loneliness like I was her middle-aged best friend. At one point she grabbed my hand and said, "Promise me you'll never depend on a man." But the irony was unbelievable because she depended on men for absolutely everything: money, validation, identity, mood, self-worth, every single thing. She didn't know how to exist without male attention. And because of that, I grew up terrified of becoming her. The problem is that children often become exactly what they fear. My first serious relationship happened when I was 23. His name was Ethan. He was patient and soft-spoken and emotionally healthy in a way that made me suspicious immediately. We met at a bookstore cafe where I worked after college. He liked poetry, called his mother every Sunday, remembered small details. At first, I thought he was boring. Now I realize he was stable. But stability felt unnatural to me. I mistook peace for lack of passion. That's what toxic childhoods do. They rewire your nervous system until chaos feels romantic. Ethan loved me carefully, and I destroyed him slowly. If he didn't text for 2 hours, I spiraled. If he wanted one night alone, I accused him of losing interest. I picked fights over tiny things because part of me constantly needed proof that abandonment was coming. And eventually, I created the very thing I feared. One night he sat across from me at dinner looking completely drained. "Ivy," he said quietly, "I feel like I'm being punished for things I never did." That sentence shattered me because he was right. I wasn't fighting Ethan. I was fighting every man my mother brought into our lives, every slammed door, every scream, every broken promise. Every night I listened to crying through thin apartment walls. Ethan reached across the table. "I love you," he said. "But I can't survive inside your fear anymore." He left 2 weeks later. And afterward, I hated myself almost as much as I hated my mother, because suddenly I saw it, the inheritance. Not money, not property, trauma. She handed me trauma like a family heirloom. And now I was passing it into every relationship I touched. After Ethan, things got worse. I dated men emotionally unavailable enough to match my damage. One cheated constantly. One disappeared for days during arguments. One punched a hole in my apartment wall. And every time some sick part of my brain whispered, "This feels familiar." Familiarity is dangerous. People think we seek happiness. We don't. We seek recognition, even if recognition destroys us. By 32, I had become hyper-independent. I paid my own bills, owned my condo, built a successful career in marketing. Friends described me as strong, but emotionally I was collapsing constantly. I couldn't trust anybody fully. Couldn't relax in love. Couldn't believe affection would stay. Whenever a man treated me well, I became suspicious. Whenever a man treated me badly, I became addicted. Exactly like my mother. That realization made me physically sick. Then came Daniel. And Daniel almost became my husband. We met when I was 35 at a friend's engagement party. He was intelligent, funny, emotionally expressive. For the first year, things felt different, safe, even. But safety has a way of terrifying people like me. The closer he got, the more unbearable intimacy became. I started testing him constantly, pulling away emotionally, creating arguments, accusing him of imaginary things. Sometimes I'd wake up at 3 in the morning overwhelmed by panic for absolutely no reason. I'd stare at him sleeping beside me and think, he's going to leave eventually. Everybody leaves eventually. One night Daniel finally asked the question no one had asked me directly before. What happened to you growing up? And I completely froze, because nobody had ever asked about me, only my reactions. My issues, my behavior, not the origin. I tried to laugh it off. But Daniel kept looking at me gently. And suddenly I started crying harder than I had in years. Not graceful crying. Ugly, shaking, gasping crying. The kind buried inside your body for decades. I told him everything. The men. The screaming, the instability. The violence. My mother choosing relationships over safety over and over again. And when I finished, Daniel held my hand quietly. Then he said something that changed me. You were emotionally abandoned long before anybody physically left. I had never heard my childhood described that way before. Emotionally abandoned. Not unloved, not abused in the obvious ways people expect. Abandoned emotionally. And suddenly my entire life made sense. Because children need emotional safety the same way they need food and water. I never had it. Not once. Not consistently. Not enough to build a healthy nervous system. Daniel convinced me to start therapy after that conversation. I resisted for months. In my family, therapy was considered weakness. My mother used to say therapists were strangers getting paid to judge you. But eventually I went. And therapy felt like somebody turning on lights inside rooms I didn't know existed. For the first time, I understood that my relationship problems weren't random. They were patterned survival responses, hypervigilance, fear of abandonment, anxious attachment, emotional dysregulation. I wasn't crazy, I was trained. And the person who trained me was my mother. That realization filled me with rage, real rage, not the kind you post online. The kind that sits inside your ribs for years. Because once you become an adult, people expect you to simply heal quietly. But nobody talks enough about the grief of realizing your parents damaged you deeply while calling in love. My mother never hit me, never starved me, never threw me out, which made it harder to explain the pain. But emotional neglect leaves invisible fractures, and invisible fractures still break people. I remember sitting in therapy one afternoon when my therapist asked, "What do you feel toward your mother?" And without hesitation I answered, "I'll never forgive her." The room went silent afterward. Even I was shocked by how fast the words came out. But they were true. Because forgiveness felt impossible when I was still living inside consequences she created. And at 40 years old I still was. Therapy changed the way I looked at my mother. But not in the beautiful, healing way people like to talk about online. It didn't soften me. At least not at first. It made me angrier. Because once you finally understand your damage, you also understand how preventable some of it was. And that realization can poison you. For months after that session, I walked around carrying rage like a second spine. Every failed relationship replayed differently in my head now. Every panic attack. Every night I sabotaged intimacy because closeness felt unsafe. Every moment I begged emotionally unavailable men to love me while distrusting the good ones. I could trace all of it back to her. Ivy Jonas, my mother. The woman who taught me that love meant instability. The woman who needed men more than she needed peace. The woman who turned me into an emotional adult before I even learned algebra. And the worst part was that she still acted like none of it happened. My mother was 63 by then and living in a small apartment in New Jersey with her latest boyfriend, a retired truck driver named Glenn. When I visited her occasionally, she behaved like she had been a wonderful mother. She'd ask questions about work, offer coffee, talk about television shows, never once mentioning the chaos she raised me inside. It was like she erased history to survive herself, but I couldn't erase it. I carried it into every room I entered, especially relationships. Daniel and I stayed together during my first year of therapy, but things became complicated quickly because healing is ugly before it becomes peaceful. People imagine therapy makes you calmer immediately. Sometimes it does the opposite. It rips old wounds open. Suddenly memories started surfacing constantly. Things I hadn't thought about in years. Like the time my mother left me alone overnight when I was 12 because she disappeared with a man named Russell after an argument. Or the time I overheard her telling a friend, "I love Ivy, but sometimes I wish I'd never become a mother so young." I was 15 when I heard that. 15. Children never forget sentences like that. They bury them alive inside their nervous systems, and those sentences keep breathing for decades. Daniel tried to support me through all of it. God, he really tried. But trauma makes love difficult even when the other person is patient. Especially then. One night, we were lying in bed when his phone buzzed on the nightstand. A completely normal moment. But I saw a woman's name flash briefly across the screen. Rachel. That was all, Rachel. Immediately my stomach dropped. I became cold, alert, dangerous. Who's Rachel? Daniel blinked, confused. A coworker. Why is she texting you at 11:30 at night? She's covering a presentation tomorrow. I could already feel my chest tightening, the panic, the suspicion. The humiliation I inherited from watching my mother get cheated on repeatedly. She could have waited until morning. Ivy. No, seriously. Why does she feel comfortable texting you this late? Daniel sat up slowly, and the look on his face crushed me because it wasn't guilt. It was exhaustion. Pure exhaustion. "We're doing it again," he said quietly. That phrase made me furious immediately. Doing it again. Like I was some predictable storm. You think I'm crazy? I think you're scared. I'm not scared. You are all the time. I got out of bed instantly. I knew this would happen eventually. What would happen? You losing interest. Daniel rubbed his face. This isn't about Rachel. It always starts small. Then came the silence. That terrible silence I knew too well from childhood. But unlike the men mother dated, Daniel didn't scream. He just looked sad, and somehow sadness hurt me more than anger ever did. You know what the hardest part is? He asked softly. What? I love you enough to understand why you act this way. But understanding it doesn't stop it from hurting. I wish I could explain what those words did to me. Because trauma survivors often expect rejection. But compassion? Compassion can feel unbearable. I started crying immediately. Not because I thought I was wrong entirely, but because deep down, I knew he was right. My fear was controlling both of us. After that night, I became obsessed with fixing myself quickly. I read psychology books constantly, listened to podcasts, journaled every day. I wanted to heal fast enough to save the relationship, but healing doesn't work like emergency surgery. It's slower, messier, and sometimes relationships die during the process. Mine did. 6 months later, Daniel ended things. Not dramatically, not cruelly, quietly, that somehow made it worse. We sat in his apartment eating takeout neither of us touched, and he looked devastated. "I don't think you trust me," he said. I opened my mouth immediately. "I do, but even I heard the lie. Because trust isn't words, it's nervous system behavior. And mine never trusted safety." Daniel reached for my hand. "I think part of you is still living in your childhood." That sentence shattered me because it was true. Emotionally, part of me was still that little girl sitting on apartment stairs listening for screaming downstairs. Still preparing for abandonment. Still waiting for chaos. Still believing love disappears overnight. Daniel squeezed my hand gently. "I hope one day you feel safe enough to be loved fully." I couldn't speak after that. He moved out 2 weeks later. And when the apartment became empty, I finally broke completely. For almost 3 months, I barely functioned outside work. I stopped answering friends, stopped cooking, stopped sleeping properly. Every night I replayed my entire life wondering whether I had become permanently damaged. That's the terrifying thing about childhood trauma. Eventually it stops feeling like trauma. It starts feeling like personality, like identity, like fate. One afternoon during therapy, my therapist asked, "What do you want from your mother?" I answered immediately, "I want her to admit it." Admit what? That she failed me. The truth was, I didn't need perfection from her anymore. I needed acknowledgement. I needed her to stop pretending my childhood was normal. Because denial can make wounds feel even deeper. So for the first time in nearly 2 years, I decided to confront her honestly. I drove to New Jersey on a rainy Thursday afternoon. The entire ride there, my stomach twisted violently. Part of me still became a child around my mother, that never fully leaves you. She opened the apartment door smiling. "Ivy, you should have called first." The smell of cigarette smoke hit me immediately. Glenn was watching television somewhere in the background. My mother hugged me quickly and started talking about grocery prices before I interrupted her. "We need to talk." She noticed my tone instantly. Her face changed. "What's wrong?" I sat at her kitchen table while she poured coffee nervously. For a few seconds, neither of us spoke. Then I finally said it. "I spent my entire life learning how to survive the childhood you gave me." Silence. My mother stared at me like she genuinely didn't understand. "What does that mean?" And suddenly I felt rage explode inside me. "It means I grew up in chaos." My voice cracked loudly. "It means I watched you destroy yourself over men for 20 years while I raised myself." "Ivy, no, you don't get to interrupt me this time." She looked stunned. I had never spoken to her that way before, not once. "You exposed me to screaming, violence, instability. I never felt safe as a child. Ever." My mother crossed her arms defensively. "I did my best." That sentence almost made me laugh. Because every damaged parent says that eventually. I did my best. As if effort erases consequences. "Your best traumatized me." Her eyes filled with tears immediately. But for once, I refused to rescue her emotionally. That used to be my role, not anymore. "You have no idea what my life was like," she whispered. "I was alone." "You weren't alone," I snapped. "You had me." That hit her hard. I saw it physically. She sat down slowly across from me. And for the first time in my entire life, my mother looked old. Not dramatic, not emotional, just tired. "You think I wanted that life?" she asked quietly. I didn't answer. Because honestly, I didn't know anymore. She stared at the table for several seconds before speaking again. "My father beat my mother nearly every day." I blinked. She had never spoken about her childhood before, not once. "He broke her jaw when I was 13, she continued softly. "I used to sleep with headphones on because I couldn't stand hearing her cry." Suddenly the room felt strange, unsteady. My mother rubbed her hands together nervously. "When I met men who paid attention to me, I confused that with safety. I didn't know the difference. I wanted to stay angry. God, I wanted to. But something painful was happening inside me. I was seeing the chain. The generational chain. Pain moving from mother to daughter like inheritance." My mother looked at me carefully. "I know I failed you in some ways. Some ways." Even then she couldn't fully say it. But it was more acknowledgement than I had ever received before. Tears filled her eyes. "I was drowning most of those years, Ivy. And I drowned with you." That sentence broke both of us. My mother started crying quietly. And suddenly I was crying too. Not because everything was fixed. Not because I forgave her. But because for the first time, we were speaking honestly instead of pretending. After nearly an hour, I finally asked the question I had carried for decades. "Why didn't you protect me?" My mother covered her mouth immediately. And the answer took a long time to come out, because some truths rot people from the inside. "I didn't know how," she whispered. That sentence haunted me for weeks afterward, because I realized something terrifying. Most damaged parents are not evil. They're unfinished people raising children while bleeding internally. That doesn't excuse the damage, but it changes the shape of the anger. I left New Jersey emotionally destroyed after that conversation. Not healed, just cracked open wider. For days afterward, I couldn't stop thinking about how trauma survives through silence. My grandmother passed fear into my mother. My mother passed fear into me. And if I'd had children before therapy, maybe I would have passed it into them too. That realization terrified me. A month later, my mother called unexpectedly. We rarely talked on the phone. "I found something," she said quietly. "What?" "A box of your childhood things." I almost said I didn't care, but something stopped me. So the next weekend, I drove back again. The box sat in her living room near the couch. Old school papers, photographs, tiny forgotten pieces of my life. Then I found a notebook. Pink cover. Small lock broken off. My childhood diary. I stared at it in shock. "I thought you threw this away." My mother looked uncomfortable. I couldn't. I opened it slowly. Most entries were childish nonsense at first. School crushes, homework complaints. But then the tone changed around age 11. The handwriting became shakier, smaller. One entry made my stomach drop instantly. "I'm scared when they scream because I think someone will die someday." Another said, "Mom cries more when she has boyfriends." Then I reached an entry written when I was 14. And suddenly I couldn't breathe. "I wish my mom loved me more than she loves men." The room became blurry immediately. I had no memory of writing that. But clearly, some part of me had known the truth long before adulthood. My mother was crying silently across the room. "I didn't know you felt that way," she whispered. I looked up at her. And for the first time in my life, I believed her. That was the tragedy. She truly hadn't known. Because she had been too consumed by survival, validation, loneliness, and chaos to fully see me. And somehow that hurt even more. After finding the diary, I stopped sleeping properly again, not because of panic this time, because of grief. Real grief. the kind that arrives quietly after anger burns itself out. For years, rage had protected me from sadness. As long as I hated my mother, I didn't have to fully mourn what I never had. But the diary changed something. Seeing my own childhood thoughts written in shaky handwriting destroyed me in a way therapy never had. Because children tell the truth before survival teaches them silence. And the truth was there in ink. I wish my mom loved me more than she loves men. I read that sentence so many times the paper nearly tore. Then one night, around 2 a.m, I realized something horrifying. I had spent my entire adult life trying to become impossible to abandon. That was the root of everything. My independence, my career obsession, my emotional control issues, even my failed relationships. I was constantly trying to earn permanence from people because nothing in my childhood ever felt permanent. Not homes, not safety, not affection, not stability. And once I saw that pattern clearly, I couldn't unsee it anymore. Suddenly my entire life looked different. I remembered every relationship where I became anxious the moment things felt serious. Every time I pushed someone away before they could leave first. Every moment I tested love instead of receiving it. I had spent decades recreating emotional conditions that felt familiar, not healthy, familiar. That distinction changed everything. A few weeks later, my therapist asked me something uncomfortable. What if your mother isn't the only person you need to forgive? I frowned immediately. I'm not forgiving the men she brought around. That's not what I mean. I stared at her. Then slowly, painfully, I understood. Myself. She meant myself. And honestly, that felt harder than forgiving my mother ever could. Because deep down, I blamed myself for becoming damaged. I blamed myself for every ruined relationship, every overreaction, every insecurity, every emotional spiral. Part of me believed I should have been stronger, healthier, more normal. But trauma doesn't work that way. Children adapt to survive the environment they're raised in. And survival behaviors often become destructive later. My therapist leaned forward gently. You learned fear before you learned safety, Ivy. Your nervous system adapted exactly the way it was trained to. I started crying almost immediately. Because for the first time in my life, someone was separating my trauma from my identity. I wasn't born broken. I was shaped. There's a difference. That realization became the beginning of something new, not healing exactly. Healing sounds too clean, too inspirational. This was slower than that, more human. I started paying attention to my reactions differently. When anxiety appeared, I stopped treating it like proof something was wrong. I started recognizing it as memory. Old fear, old programming. That didn't make it disappear overnight. But it stopped controlling me completely. Then something unexpected happened. 3 months later, Daniel called me. I almost didn't answer. My heart started pounding the second I saw his name. Part of me still loved him desperately. Another part felt ashamed, but eventually I picked up. Hey, he said softly. Hearing his voice after months felt strange. Like reopening a wound that had finally scabbed over. Hi, we talked awkwardly at first. Work, weather, small things. Then he finally said, I heard from Claire that you've been doing better. Claire was a mutual friend. I smiled faintly. I'm trying. I'm glad. Silence settled between us for a moment. Then he asked, would you want to get coffee sometime? My stomach tightened immediately. Fear, hope, panic, all at once. The old version of me would have either clung too hard or avoided him entirely. But therapy had taught me something important. Emotions don't always need immediate action. So instead of reacting impulsively, I breathed and answered honestly. I think I like that. We met the following Saturday at a quiet cafe downtown. When I saw him walking toward me, Something inside my chest ached instantly. He looked almost the same. Still calm. Still gentle. Still carrying that emotional steadiness I used to distrust. But this time I noticed something different too. He seemed cautious around me. And realizing I had caused that hurt more than I wanted to admit, we talked for nearly 3 hours. Not about getting back together. Not at first. About therapy, growth, fear, life. At one point Daniel looked at me carefully and said, "You seem quieter." I laughed softly. I spent most of my life emotionally preparing for disaster. And now? I stared down at my coffee. Now I'm tired. He nodded slowly like he understood exactly what I meant. Then he said something that stayed with me afterward. "You know, Ivy, you always thought love would trap you. But I think fear trapped you more than love ever did." That sentence followed me home. Because it was true. Fear had controlled nearly every important decision in my life. Fear of abandonment. Fear of betrayal. Fear of becoming my mother. Fear of needing someone too much. And ironically, those fears had created the loneliness I hated most. Daniel and I started seeing each other casually after that. Slowly, very slowly. This time things felt different, but not because my trauma disappeared magically. It was different because I stopped pretending my fear was truth. One night, about 2 months after reconnecting, something happened that would have triggered a massive fight in the past. Daniel canceled dinner plans because of a work emergency. Old Ivy would have spiraled instantly. He's losing interest. He's lying. Someone else matters more. But instead of reacting immediately, I sat with the discomfort. And underneath the panic, I recognized something familiar, not present danger. Childhood abandonment. There's a difference. That moment sounds small, but it wasn't. It was the first time in my life I interrupted the cycle instead of obeying it. When Daniel called later apologizing, I simply said, "I understand." And for once, I genuinely did. Healing often looks invisible from the outside. It's not dramatic speeches. It's tiny interrupted reactions. Tiny moments where you choose reality over fear. Months passed. Then one evening my mother called crying. Immediately my body tensed. For years, her tears meant emotional chaos was coming. "I'm at the hospital," she whispered. My stomach dropped. "What happened?" "It's Glenn. Heart attack." I drove there immediately. The entire ride, old resentment and new compassion fought inside me constantly. When I arrived, my mother looked smaller somehow, fragile, terrified. For the first time in my life, I saw her not just as my mother, but as a woman. An aging woman shaped by fear long before I existed. She grabbed my hand tightly in the waiting room. "I don't want to be alone," she whispered. And suddenly I understood something painful. My mother had spent her entire life terrified too. That fear had ruled her relationships, her choices, her neediness, her instability. Just like mine ruled me. Different generation, same wound. Glenn survived. Minor heart attack, recoverable. But during those long hospital hours, my mother and I talked more honestly than we ever had before. At one point, she looked at me quietly and asked, "Do you hate me?" The question hit me hard because for years the answer would have been simple, yes. But now it was complicated. "I hated what my childhood felt like," I answered carefully. Tears filled her eyes immediately. "I know, and I'm still angry sometimes." "I know, but I don't think you destroyed me on purpose." That broke her completely. She covered her face crying silently. "I loved you," she whispered. And for the first time in my life, I answered honestly, "I know you did," because that was the tragedy of it all. My mother loved me. She just didn't know how to love me safely. People think bad parenting always comes from cruelty. Sometimes it comes from damage, from emotional immaturity, from unresolved trauma, from people having children before learning how to survive themselves. understanding that didn't erase my pain. But it released something inside me. The need to keep bleeding forever. A few months later, Daniel invited me to spend a weekend with him at a small cabin near a lake in Vermont. The old version of me would have panicked over intimacy that close. But this time felt calmer, not perfect, just calmer. One night we sat outside wrapped in blankets, watching the water move quietly under moonlight. Daniel looked at me and smiled softly. "You know what I notice now?" "What?" "You let yourself relax sometimes." I laughed quietly. "That's new for me, I know." There was a long silence afterward. Peaceful silence. Not the terrifying kind from my childhood. And that difference nearly made me emotional. Then Daniel reached for my hand. "I'm proud of you." 3 simple words. But nobody had ever said that to me about emotional growth before. Not once. I looked out at the lake trying not to cry. "You know something strange?" I admitted quietly. "What?" "I spent most of my life believing love would destroy me." Daniel squeezed my hand gently. "And now?" I stared at the dark water for several seconds before answering. "Now I think fear almost did." That night, lying beside him, I realized something profound. Healing doesn't mean becoming untouched. It means the past stops controlling every room you walk into. It means your childhood no longer makes every decision for you. It means recognizing fear without worshiping it. I still get anxious sometimes. I still overthink. Sometimes old panic rises suddenly for no reason at all. Trauma leaves fingerprints, but now I recognize them. And recognition changes everything. Last month, my mother and I had dinner together for the first time without tension swallowing the entire evening. At one point she smiled sadly and said, "You seem happier lately." I thought about that for a second. Then I answered truthfully, "I think I finally stopped waiting for love to become dangerous." She looked down quietly after that. Maybe because she understood exactly what I meant. Or maybe because she knew where I learned that fear. Either way, neither of us spoke for a while. And strangely, the silence felt peaceful, not empty, not threatening, just human. My name is Ivy Jonas. I'm 40 years old. And for most of my life, I blamed my mother for everything broken inside me. Part of that blame was deserved. Children carry what parents fail to heal. That's true. But eventually I learned something harder. If you spend your entire life staring at the wound, you never learn how to close it. I still haven't forgiven everything. Maybe I never fully will. Some childhoods leave scars too deep for complete forgiveness, but hatred stopped being my home. And honestly, that saved my life more than forgiveness ever could. If you grew up watching love destroy the people who taught you about it, how long did it take before you realized fear was shaping your relationships too?